You don't get to be angry about a friendship, Aaron. That's not a real thing to be angry about. My name is Aaron. I'm 43, I teach 11th grade American history at a public high school in Tulsa, and I was standing in our garage at 11 at night, holding my wife's phone with a name on the screen I recognized instantly even though I'd never once seen it there before. Connor. No last name. Just Connor, and a string of texts going back further than the phone itself could have held, which meant she'd been backing them up, moving them from device to device, for years. Rachel is 38. She runs administration at a hospital across town, the kind of job that eats 10-hour days and comes home too tired most nights to talk about anything except what needs doing tomorrow. We've been married 11 years. We have 2 kids, Zoe, 9, who reads at a level 2 grades ahead and corrects my grammar at dinner, and Sam, 6, who still thinks I invented thunderstorms because I once explained them to him with too much confidence. I hadn't been looking for anything. That's the part one need to say plainly, because I think people assume a discovery like this comes from suspicion, from months of quiet detective work. Mine didn't. Her phone had died at 8 that night, mine was charging, and she'd asked me to grab hers off the charger and bring it up so she could set an alarm before bed. A text came through while I was carrying it up the stairs. I saw the name. I saw the first few words of the message, visible on the lock screen without me even trying to see them. I stopped on the 3rd step and stood there for a long moment before I made myself keep walking. I didn't say anything that night. I handed her the phone, kissed her, went to bed, and lay there next to her for 2 hours, running the name Connor through every corner of memory I had, until I finally placed him, a boyfriend from her college years, before me, someone she'd mentioned maybe 3 times in 11 years of marriage, always in the past tense, always framed as ancient history that had nothing to do with us. Except the message on that lock screen hadn't read like ancient history. It had read like something ongoing. I went into the garage the next night while she was giving Sam a bath, told myself I was looking for a specific memory, not proof of anything, and unlocked her phone with the code I'd known for years because we'd never had secrets from each other, or so I'd believed. The thread with Connor went back, I counted, sitting on an overturned paint can in that garage, 6 years. Not constant. Not daily. But steady, patient, the kind of contact that survives because neither person lets it fully die. I want to tell you I closed the phone immediately and confronted her. I didn't. I sat in that garage until nearly midnight, scrolling backward through 6 years of a relationship I hadn't known existed, and by the time I set the phone down, I understood 2 things with total clarity. I was going to need to know everything, and I had absolutely no idea, after 11 years of marriage, who exactly I'd been sleeping next to for the last 6 of them. I want to go back further than the garage, because once I started looking, I found 6 years of small things I'd simply never assembled into a shape before. Rachel had a habit, going back further than I could clearly place, of taking a walk alone most evenings, 20 minutes, sometimes 30, always after the kids were down, always described as needing to clear her head after a long shift. I never questioned it. I actually admired it, in the vague, unexamined way you admire your spouse's self-care rituals without wondering what they're actually for. She had a college friend group chat she mentioned occasionally, reunions she'd go to every couple of years, a weekend here or there with women she'd known since her 20s. I never asked for names. I never asked who was in the group. I trusted the framing completely, because trusting the framing required nothing further of me. Once I knew what I was looking at, the pattern behind those trips reorganized itself instantly. The reunion 2 years ago, the one she'd come back from a day later than planned because the venue extended the weekend, the location, once I checked the message thread states, matched a weekend Connor had also referenced. An offhand comment about seeing you again was strange, in a good way 3 days after she got home. I found, scrolling further back, a stretch 4 years earlier where the messages thinned out almost entirely for about 5 months, coinciding, I realized with a specific kind of nausea, with the period right after Sam was born, when Rachel had told me, more than once, that she felt like she'd disappeared into motherhood, lost track of who she used to be. I hadn't known, at the time, that she'd apparently reached backward for an old version of herself instead of telling me she needed help finding a new one. The behavioral signs, once I let myself see them as signs rather than ordinary marriage texture, were everywhere. She'd started, a few years back, keeping her phone face down on nightstands and counters, not obviously, not suspiciously, just a habit that had crept in so gradually I'd never registered its beginning. She flinched, almost imperceptibly, any time I picked up her phone to check the time or answer a call for her, a half-second tension in her shoulders that resolved itself so quickly I'd never once consciously noticed it before I had a reason to look for it. There was a night, maybe 2 years back, when she'd cried during a movie, nothing dramatic, just quiet tears during a scene about two people who'd loved each other young and lost each other to circumstance, and when I asked if she was okay, she'd said something about being tired, hormonal, nothing worth discussing. I'd let it go, the way I let almost everything go, because asking felt like more effort than the moment seemed to require. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you've ever looked back at a whole collection of ordinary evenings and realized, all at once, that half of them were being quietly narrated to you by someone editing the story in real time, you understand exactly how strange it feels to have 6 years of your own memory rewritten in a single garagelit night. I didn't know it then. This is what Rachel was living through, on the night of that movie, the one where she cried during a scene about two people who lost each other. I told myself it was just a movie. I told myself that for the whole drive home and most of that night, lying next to Aaron while he slept, feeling something in my chest that had no good name, not regret, not exactly longing, something closer to grief for a version of my life I'd never actually chosen to give up, because I never let myself fully choose it in the first place. I tell Connor about nights like that sometimes, weeks later, in careful, half-honest messages that never quite said the whole truth even to him. I told myself keeping that door cracked open wasn't hurting anyone, because nothing physical had happened in years, because it was just talking, because everyone keeps some room in themselves that belongs to a person from before. That's what she told me, much later. That night, I only knew she'd cried during a movie and called it hormones. The following spring, 3 years before I found the phone, Rachel had gone through a stretch of unusual restlessness I'd chalked up to work stress, snapping at small things, disappearing into long showers, staring out the kitchen window some evenings with an expression I'd once, in a private, half-joking thought, described to myself as somewhere else entirely. I'd asked if everything was okay at the hospital. She'd said yes, just busy season, budget cuts, the usual grind. I believed her completely, because believing her was so much easier than following the thread of what somewhere else entirely might actually mean. By the time I sat in that garage with her phone, I understood that I'd spent 6 years watching a woman quietly manage two emotional lives at once, and I had never once, in all that time, asked the direct question that might have ended it years earlier. That's the part of this I've had to carry the longest, not just what Rachel did, but how completely my own instinct to avoid hard conversations had made her secret easy to keep. I didn't confront her the night I found the phone in the garage. I told myself I needed more before I said anything. The same instinct that had let 6 years of this pass without a single direct question now redirected itself into something that looked, on the surface, like caution, but felt, underneath, like the same old fear of the conversation itself. Over the following 2 weeks, I read everything. Not proudly, I want to be honest that this wasn't some righteous investigation, it was closer to compulsion, sitting in the garage most nights after Rachel went up to bed, scrolling through 6 years of a relationship conducted almost entirely in careful, deniable language. Nothing explicit. No obvious confession of anything physical, at least not in writing. But an intimacy unmistakable in its rhythm, the way two people write to each other when they've decided, without ever saying so directly, that this connection matters more than either of them is willing to name out loud. I found references to 2 in-person meetings beyond the reunion trip, a lunch 18 months back, framed in the messages as good to finally catch up properly, and a longer visit just this past winter, 3 days Rachel had told me was a solo work conference in Dallas. I checked her old calendar entries against the message dates. They matched. There had never been a conference. I found, in messages from just that winter, something that read less like nostalgia and more like an active, ongoing decision being made in real time, Connor asking, plainly, whether she'd ever consider actually being together, and Rachel's answer, careful and evasive, neither yes nor no, something about timing and the kids and not being ready to blow up 2 lives at once. I sat with that message longer than any other. It told me this wasn't simply an emotional habit she'd never fully broken. It was an active question she was still deciding, 6 years in, and I had no idea I'd been living inside her hesitation the entire time. I chased 2 false leads during those weeks, the way you do when you're looking hard enough at everything. I became briefly suspicious that Rachel's oldest friend Priya knew and had been covering for her. Some of the reunion trips had included Priya, and for several days I built an entire theory around Priya as an active accomplice, before realizing, from a separate, unrelated thread of messages, that Priya genuinely believed the reunions were exactly what they claimed to be. She wasn't lying to me. She simply hadn't been told the truth either. I also spent several days convinced, briefly, that this was purely physical, an affair in the straightforward sense, and struggled almost as much with the alternative, once the evidence pointed instead toward something slower and stranger, a woman who had never fully let go of a version of her own life, 6 years of careful, half-committed limbo, neither ending it with Connor nor ever telling me it existed. By the second week, I had enough dates, message excerpts, calendar contradictions, the Dallas trip that had never been a conference at all. I hadn't said a word to Rachel. I moved through our house watching her make dinner, help Zoe with homework, read to Sam at bedtime, and held, the entire time, the total and specific knowledge of 6 years I hadn't known I was living alongside. I remember one night near the end of that stretch, lying beside her in the dark, feeling her breathing settle into sleep the way it had for 11 years, and understanding that I no longer knew which parts of our marriage had been real and which had simply been the parts of her life she'd had left over, after Connor had already taken what he'd taken. That thought didn't arrive gently. It arrived like something breaking loose that had been bolted down for a long time, and once it broke, I understood I wasn't going to be able to handle this quietly for much longer. I didn't need much more proof, honestly. By the third week, what I had was already more than enough to end a marriage on its own. But I kept collecting anyway, because some part of me, the same part that had avoided 6 years of hard questions, still wanted to be certain before I let the last version of my old life collapse. I found the Dallas trip's actual hotel confirmation, buried in an old email Rachel had forgotten to delete, a 2-person reservation, paid on a card I didn't recognize, which took me 2 more days to trace back to an account Rachel had apparently opened years earlier and never mentioned, used exclusively, as far as I could tell, for exactly this purpose. I found a folder of old photographs on a cloud backup neither of us actively used anymore, Rachel and Connor from college, kept and organized long after any reasonable nostalgia would have let them go, alongside 3 photographs from more recent years, including one from the winter trip, both of them smiling in a way I recognized instantly because I'd seen that exact smile aimed at me for 11 years and hadn't understood, until that moment, that it wasn't uniquely mine. I confirmed, through the messages, that this had in fact become physical again during the winter trip, Connor's own words, careless in a way Rachel's never quite were, referencing the hotel room directly. I sat with that specific piece of evidence longer than any other single thing I found. It was the moment the story stopped being ambiguous, stopped being something I could still, in some private corner of myself, call complicated rather than simply a betrayal. I want to be honest about the mistake I made during this stretch, because it matters to the story that follows. I told my brother, in a low moment, more than I probably should have before deciding what I actually wanted to do, not out of malice, but because I needed one other person to confirm this was as bad as it felt. My brother, understandably furious on my behalf, said something to his wife, who happened to know Rachel's sister, and within 4 days, word had started moving through the edges of both our families before I'd said a single word to Rachel directly. That wasn't a strategic mistake exactly. It was an emotional one, the first real crack in my own composure, the first sign that I wasn't going to be able to hold this as quietly and methodically as I'd planned. By the 4th week, I understood the confrontation was coming whether I orchestrated it carefully or not, because the secret had already started leaking past the 2 of us. I chose a Friday night, once the kids were down, and told Rachel we needed to talk, in a voice that must have carried enough weight that she went very still before I'd said anything else. I laid the phone on the kitchen table, screen already open to the Dallas hotel confirmation, and said, 6 years, Rachel. I know about 6 years. I didn't stay calm. I want to be honest about that, because I'd told myself for weeks I'd handle this with some kind of composed dignity, and instead, once the first sentence was out, something in me that had been controlled for a solid month finally gave way entirely. I raised my voice. I said things about Connor, about the Dallas trip, about 11 years of marriage built, apparently, next to a door she'd never actually closed. Old grievances I hadn't even known I was carrying surfaced in that same breath every time she'd stayed late at work without calling. Every trip I'd never questioned, years of small trust I'd extended without asking a single hard question in return, all of it flooding out at once, tangled together with the actual betrayal until I could barely separate one complaint from another. Rachel didn't collapse, and she didn't plead. She came back at me just as hard, immediately, no denial at all. She'd clearly understood, the moment the phone hit the table, that this conversation had moved past any version of it she could manage or minimize. She said I had no idea what 6 years of feeling invisible in my own house felt like, that I'd never once asked her a real question about her inner life in over a decade, that I'd built an entire marriage on the assumption that things were fine simply because I preferred not to check. She brought up things unrelated to Connor entirely, my long hours grading papers instead of talking to her at night, a fight we'd had 4 years earlier about my mother that she'd apparently never actually let go of, my habit of ending every disagreement early rather than finishing it. We said things in that kitchen that neither of us walked back afterward. I told her I didn't recognize the person standing in front of me. She told me I'd never actually tried to know the person standing in front of me, not really, not once in 11 years. It was loud enough, twice, that I heard myself and thought, distantly, that the neighbors could probably hear every word. It stopped only when Zoe appeared at the top of the stairs, 9 years old, asking in a small voice why we were yelling, and both of us went completely silent in the exact same instant, the fight collapsing all at once under the weight of a 9-year-old standing there in pajamas, watching two people she trusted completely fall apart in front of her for the first time in her life. I sent Zoe back to bed. Rachel and I sat down at the same table, both of us breathing hard, and something in the silence after that outburst finally let the real conversation happen. She told me everything then, in her own words, once the fight had burned itself down to something quieter. She said it started the reunion 6 years back, seeing Connor again after more than a decade and feeling, in one conversation, more like the person she used to be than she'd felt in years of marriage and motherhood. She said the first message afterward felt harmless, just catching up, and she told herself that story for months, then years, adding a small new permission each time, one lunch, one longer visit, each one justified as nothing more than what came before it. She said the fear had always been there, underneath fear of losing me, fear of losing the family we'd built, but also, and this was the part she said hurt most to admit, fear of fully closing a door on a version of her life she'd never actually finished grieving. She said the shame lived in exact, specific places. She couldn't look at our wedding photos on the hallway wall for the 2 days after the Dallas trip, had actually taken them down temporarily, telling me it was for cleaning. She said she'd tried, twice, to end things with Connor for good, and each time found a reason within weeks to let the door crack open again, because some part of her had never believed she deserved to simply choose one life fully and let the other one go. I told her I understood the words. I told her understanding them didn't undo 6 years of not knowing which parts of my marriage had been real. The scandal, once it started, moved faster than either of us controlled. My brother's earlier slip had already put fragments of the story into both our families before that Friday night ended, and within a week, most of Rachel's side knew too, along with several of the parents from Zoe's school where Rachel had once volunteered alongside Priya, who found out the truth about the reunions had been a cover for something else entirely and stopped speaking to Rachel almost immediately, hurt at having been used, unknowingly, for 6 years' worth of alibi. The divorce that followed wasn't quiet. Rachel's version of events, in the beginning, tried to frame it as something smaller than what the messages actually showed, and when that version collided publicly with what people had already heard through the family grapevine, it did lasting damage to how she was seen at the hospital where she worked, in a professional community small enough that the story reached colleagues within a month. She didn't lose her job. She lost the reputation she'd spent years building as the reliable, composed person everyone assumed she was. Connor's own life came apart around the same time. His ex-wife, who had never fully understood why their marriage ended years earlier, found out, through the same family network, that Connor had been carrying on an ongoing relationship with someone else's wife for the entire back half of their own marriage, information that reframed their divorce in a way that cost him custody flexibility with his own 2 kids and, eventually, most of his standing in a small enough town that everyone eventually heard. The divorce settlement went almost entirely in my favor, the finances, most of the house equity, primary physical custody of Zoe and Sam, with Rachel's own attorney advising her, given the scale and duration of what had happened, not to fight harder than she did. I didn't feel triumphant about that. I felt, mostly, tired in a way that took most of the following year to fully lift. I moved with the kids into a smaller house across town within 4 months. Rachel sees Zoe and Sam on a fixed schedule now, careful and civil, both of us working hard, for their sake, not to let what happened between us become the story either of them grows up carrying. I think often about that garage, that first night with her phone in my hand, the 6 years of ordinary evenings I'd never once questioned. I understand now that trust without curiosity isn't really trust, it's just the shape of a question you were too comfortable to ask, for as long as not asking cost you nothing visible. It cost me everything eventually. It just took 6 years to send the bill. I realized something, sitting alone in that new house the first week, unpacking boxes after the kids had gone to bed. I had spent 11 years assuming a good marriage was simply the absence of obvious problems, rather than something built, actively, through the harder work of actually knowing the person across from you. Rachel's unresolved history with Connor didn't excuse what she did. But my own comfortable blindness had given that history 6 full years of room to breathe, right under my roof, without a single hard question ever standing in its way. What makes this story different from a simple affair is that Rachel never actually chose between the two men, not for 6 years, not until the choice was finally made for her by a phone left on a garage counter and a message she never expected Aaron to see. That refusal to choose wasn't indecision in the ordinary sense. It was its own kind of decision, made quietly, over and over, every time she let the door crack open instead of closing it for good. The scandal that followed reveals something the confrontation scene alone couldn't, that secrets built to survive privately rarely survive contact with other people once they're finally exposed. Aaron slipped to his brother, born from raw emotional need rather than strategy, set in motion a version of exposure neither he nor Rachel controlled, and the public unraveling that followed did more lasting damage to Rachel's standing than the private confrontation itself. Betrayal contained is one kind of consequence. Betrayal that becomes communal knowledge is another, heavier one entirely. There's also something worth sitting with in how much of this fight, once it finally happened, was never really about Connor at all. 11 years of small, unaddressed resentments, Aaron's long hours, an old fight about his mother, years of conversations ended early rather than finished, surfaced in that kitchen alongside the actual betrayal, tangled together so completely that neither of them could fully separate the affair from everything else that had gone quietly unspoken for over a decade. That tangle is often the real architecture underneath a scandal this size, not one clean betrayal, but years of smaller ones nobody named out loud until the biggest one finally forced the rest into the open. What lingers longest here isn't really the 6 years of secrecy. It's the question of what it costs two people to build a life together without ever fully risking the harder conversations that might have tested whether that life was something both of them had actually, fully chosen. Which leaves me wondering something worth sitting with. How many marriages survived not because both people chose them completely, but because neither one ever had to prove they had? The thing I keep coming back to isn't the phone in the garage, or even the fight that finally tore everything into the open. It's the 6 years before that, all those ordinary evenings, all those walks and reunions and quiet trips I never once questioned, because questioning them would have required something harder of me than simply trusting the version of the story I was handed. I don't think Rachel set out, 6 years ago, to build a double life. I think she found a door that had never fully closed, and told herself, one small permission at a time, that leaving it cracked open cost nothing. It cost more than either of us understood until it all came out at once, loud enough for our own daughter to hear from the top of the stairs. If you've ever let something stay comfortable because asking the real question felt like more than you could carry, you already understand exactly why it took me 6 years I didn't even know I was living through to finally find out the truth. Tell me one word in the comments for a door in your own life you never fully closed, or one you wish someone had asked you about sooner. Thank you for sitting with this one through every part of it tonight.